When Sophie Taylor stepped into Bright Horizons Hospital, she brought with her the hope and enthusiasm of a young, talented nurse. Bright Horizons, a symbol of excellence in healthcare, was situated in a prosperous suburban community. This was the place where she dreamed of proving herself, where she believed she would have the chance to grow and contribute wholeheartedly. However, what she didn't know was that, despite the progress society had made in eliminating racial prejudice, deep-seated biases still lurked beneath the surface, like shadows hiding in the dark. As a black woman, Sophie often faced challenges that went unnoticed by others: furtive glances, subtle words, and an odd sense of isolation. The stories she had heard about discrimination in healthcare settings made her nervous, yet she remained determined to press on, believing that she would prove her worth. The moment she stepped through the hospital doors, Sophie immediately felt the heavy air of disinfectants, mixed with an unspoken tension that hung in the air. Though a bit anxious, she stood tall, resolute to make a good first impression. But as she approached the nurse's station, the atmosphere around her suddenly felt strange. Conversations halted abruptly, and eyes quickly shifted away, as though she didn't belong. Sophie fought to suppress the familiar feeling of alienation and took a deep breath to steady herself before calmly speaking up. "Excuse me, I'm Sophie Taylor, the new nurse. Could you direct me to the head nurse's office?" Her words cut through the silence, breaking the invisible barriers surrounding her. But would this be the start of a challenging journey, or a place where Sophie would find the strength to confront the biases she had never anticipated? The main corridor of Bright Horizons Hospital was brightly lit with neon lights, reflecting off the polished white tile floor. The silence was so profound that the sound of footsteps echoed like drops of water falling into a dry well. Sophie Taylor stood at the reception desk, trying to maintain a confident demeanor despite feeling a bit uneasy. A nurse with bright blonde hair, neatly tied under a white cap, looked up from the file she had been reading. Her smooth, pale skin stood out under the cold light, but her sharp blue eyes gave off an air of aloof detachment. "Of course, just go down the hallway and take the third door on your right," she replied in a flat tone, devoid of any enthusiasm. "Thank you very much." Sophie nodded, offering a polite smile before turning away. Curious eyes followed her every step. Sophie felt the atmosphere around her thicken, as if every movement of hers was being watched and analyzed. The sound of her rubber shoes echoed on the tile floor, breaking the near-perfect silence of the long corridor. As she passed closed doors, Sophie could hear faint sounds from within: beeping machines, papers rustling, and hushed exchanges. All these sounds blended together, forming the heartbeat of the hospital, a lively yet pressure-filled environment. As she approached the head nurse's office, Sophie was startled when a tall man appeared from the adjacent room. He wore a long white coat, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, exuding the demeanor of someone with vast experience. His deep-set eyes, hidden behind thin-rimmed glasses, glanced over Sophie for a moment, like headlights sweeping over a dark road, leaving behind a feeling of coldness and distance. "Good morning, Doctor. I'm Sophie Taylor, the new nurse." "It's a pleasure to meet you." Sophie smiled, hoping her friendliness would soften the tense atmosphere. The man paused, scrutinizing her for a few seconds as if evaluating her. "Dr. Thomas," he replied briefly, his tone indifferent. "I hope you've been properly guided about the procedures here." Without waiting for Sophie to respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing still in the empty corridor. Sophie took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and then continued toward the head nurse's office. The office door swung open, revealing a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes. "Ms. Taylor, please come in, Mrs." Linda Harper's voice rang out, clear and authoritative. Sophie entered the tidy yet imposing room. "Mrs." Harper sat behind a large wooden desk, with shelves full of medical documents and files behind her. Her piercing gaze swept over Sophie like a spotlight searching for every detail. She asked short, direct questions, leaving no room for hesitation. Sophie answered with caution and confidence, though her nerves were palpable. When she left the office, Sophie felt as though she had just undergone her first trial. Her first day at work passed with a series of procedural orientations, paperwork signing, and familiarizing herself with the hospital space. But what caught Sophie's attention the most was the cold atmosphere among her colleagues. Conversation stopped as she walked in. Eyes swept over her, not with welcoming gazes but with scrutiny and wariness. She tried to strike up conversations with a few nurses, but the responses were polite yet distant. By the end of the shift, Sophie felt physically and mentally exhausted. As she packed her things in her locker, she overheard whispers from two nurses nearby. "Did you see the new staff member?" "Yeah. I don't understand what they were thinking when they hired her. This area isn't for someone like her." Sophie stood frozen, her hand pausing on the locker door. The words felt like a knife, deeply cutting into her self-esteem. When she stepped out of the hospital, the cold wind swept through the outside corridor, making her clutch her coat tighter. Sitting on a bench at the bus stop, Sophie took out her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Mom, my first day was so tough." Her voice trembled as she tried not to cry. There was a brief silence on the other end before her mother responded, her voice warm but firm. "Sophie, you're stronger than you think. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not good enough. You've worked hard to get here, and you deserve it." Her mother's words were like a flickering flame, lighting a spark in Sophie's heart. Suddenly, a sleek black Mercedes drove by, slowing down just near the bus stop. Through the window, Sophie recognized the cold gaze of Dr. Thomas Smith, the man she had heard mixed stories about, both regarding his talent and his attitude. The car sped off, leaving an indescribable feeling in her chest. Sophie straightened up, her eyes shining with determination. She knew the road ahead would be full of challenges, but she was not alone. With the support of her family and belief in herself, she was ready to face whatever challenges awaited her at Bright Horizons. As the bus neared, Sophie was ready to face a new day, though she had no idea that her presence at Bright Horizons would soon spark a chain of events that would directly challenge the hospital's cultural foundations. Long-hidden prejudices would be exposed, forcing the hospital to confront the changes that had long been neglected. In the weeks to come, work at Bright Horizons Hospital would be like a slow-burning fuse, each day adding more tension to the already challenging work environment Sophie Taylor found herself in. The coldness she endured on her first day gradually transformed into a more insidious form of exclusion. Subtle, yet undeniable. As Sophie conducted her morning rounds, she couldn't help but notice the difference in how she was treated compared to her white colleagues. Dr. Thomas Smith, a seasoned doctor, seemed to take pleasure in finding faults in her work, no matter how diligently she performed her duties. "Nurse Taylor, Doctor," Smith called out loudly, his voice echoing through the busy nurse station. "I hope by now you're familiar with our procedures. We can't afford any mistakes." The emphasis on the word mistakes sent a chill down Sophie's spine. She looked at him with steady eyes, refusing to be intimidated. "Of course, Dr. Smith. I assure you I am fully proficient in all the hospital's procedures." Dr. Smith raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "We'll see," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We don't expect you to learn everything there is to know." His words struck Sophie's pride like a heavy blow, but she didn't let any sign of hesitation show. The other nurses around her pretended to be busy with their tasks, but it was clear they were listening intently to every word Dr. Smith spoke. As he walked away, Sophie felt the weight of his unspoken judgment pressing on her throughout the day. Sophie noticed she was often given more challenging and difficult tasks, while her white colleagues were assigned simpler cases. Time and time again, she found herself handling complex medical situations and intricate procedures requiring precision. One morning, a colleague asked her sweetly, "Sophie, could you take Mr. Donald to room 305? He's a bit challenging today." Sophie nodded, knowing that challenging was just a euphemism. Mr. Donald was infamous for his outbursts of racism, and he had made 2 nurses cry just that week. Nevertheless, Sophie approached the task with determination, intent on proving her worth. Entering Mr. Donald's room, she braced herself for the inevitable criticism. Sophie couldn't help but wonder if this task was just another way to test her resolve, or worse, a trap set for her to fail. "What are you doing here, Mr.?" Donald's voice thundered angrily when he saw Sophie enter the room. His gaze was sharp as a knife, shooting out flames of hatred. "I told you I don't want any black nurses touching me." His words hit Sophie like a punch to the face, thickening the already tense atmosphere in the room. The humiliation roiled within her, but she didn't let it show. Sophie took a deep breath, her eyes lighting up with resolve. "I'm here to check your vital signs and change your bandages. I'm fully qualified to care for you." Her voice was calm, but each word carried strength, as though she was fighting not just for herself but for all those who had been despised like her. Despite the insult, she worked professionally, not allowing the hatred to affect the quality of her care. Every bandage change, every note she took was done with meticulous care, because she knew that the most important thing was to preserve the patient's life, no matter who they were. As she left the room, Sophie felt the tension in the air, as if all her efforts couldn't erase the shadow of hostility. At that moment, Dr. Thomas Smith appeared in the hallway, his cold eyes observing her. "Everything okay, Nurse Taylor? We heard some noise in there," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm, as if searching for a mistake in her work. Sophie didn't let herself be drawn into his game. "Everything is stable. Is there anything else I should be aware of?" She replied straightforwardly, her gaze never leaving his. "Dr." Smith seemed surprised, but quickly resumed his usual air of arrogance. "I hope you keep that composure. We don't want any complaints, do we?" he said, his eyes challenging her. Sophie understood that she was always having to prove her capabilities in this harsh environment. But every time she thought about speaking up, her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't let them see you falter." Those words, though long ago, were a powerful reminder that kept her grounded. By the end of the day, as Sophie walked through the hospital corridor, she overheard whispers of disdain from her colleagues. The sidelong glances, the mocking words behind her back, weighed heavily on her chest. But instead of responding, she held her head high, as if none of it could shake her. "She doesn't deserve that position," one colleague said, their eyes full of contempt. "She's just a black nurse. How could she care for VIP patients?" Sophie didn't respond. She had no time to pay attention to their words. She knew she wasn't just fighting for herself, but for justice, to break down all the prejudices and open the door of hope for future generations. As she stood at the bus station, Dr. Thomas Smith's familiar black Mercedes suddenly pulled up beside her. The car window slowly rolled down, and his voice rang out, dripping with false concern. "Nurse Taylor waiting for the bus." "Such a shame. Seems like that's all you can afford, huh? Nurse's pay isn't much, right?" His sarcastic words were like a knife to her heart. Before Sophie could react, the car sped off, leaving her standing in silence, her humiliation and anger boiling over. His taunts struck deep into her self-esteem, reminding her that every day at Bright Horizons was a grueling test, not just of her professional skills, but of her character. On the bus, Sophie felt the weight on her heart. All the joy and hope she had when she first started at the hospital now seemed like a distant memory. The contemptuous glances and cruel words had eroded everything. But in that moment, a voice inside her whispered, "There has to be something better." And that voice made her wonder whether she would crumble under the pressure, or if her resilience would be the guiding light for change. Sophie closed her eyes, sitting quietly on the bus as it glided through the dark streets, drawing strength from the words her mother had once taught her. She knew that no matter what battle tomorrow brought, she would be ready to face it all. Little did she know, an unexpected ally would soon appear, helping her make a difference in this fight. When the bus reached the stop, Sophie got off, more determined than ever. Tomorrow would be another battle, and she was ready. The next morning, Sophie woke up with a renewed sense of determination. She had spent the entire night reflecting on the painful experiences she had endured over the past few weeks, wondering why she continued to persevere in this challenging job. But then, a faint light flickered in her mind. She chose to become a nurse not only because of her love for the profession, but because she believed that helping others was the way she could change their lives, no matter how difficult it might be. This realization made her more resolute than ever. As she entered the hospital that morning, the atmosphere around her seemed to change. Everything was fast-paced and urgent. Medical staff moved quickly, preparing for a special case. A colleague whispered with a curious expression, "I hear a VIP patient is coming. He broke both arms in a skiing accident. The hospital is about to have a surprise inspection, right?" Before Sophie could ask more, Dr. Thomas Smith appeared. His cold, sharp gaze remained unchanged, but today he assigned Sophie a special task. "Nurse Taylor, you will take care of patient Oliver James," he said, his voice firm and commanding. Sophie sensed a shift in the air, a strange tension, as if everything was being monitored. A vague sense of unease rose in her chest. But Sophie had no choice but to complete the task. She entered the patient's room, where a middle-aged man with a dignified appearance and commanding presence lay on the bed. His arms were tightly bandaged. "Good morning, Mr. James," Sophie smiled, her voice gentle but confident. "I'm Nurse Sophie Taylor. I'll be taking care of you during your time here." Mr. James looked at her, his sharp gaze showing friendliness, completely different from the patients she had cared for before. "Good morning, Nurse Taylor," he replied, his voice strong and impressive. "Thank you for taking care of me. I didn't expect to be lying here after this accident." Over the next few days, Sophie began to notice a clear difference in Mr. James's attitude. He was not like the other patients she had cared for. He listened to her, asked about her life, and showed no signs of discrimination. The feeling of being respected and valued gave Sophie a great sense of encouragement. But not everything was easy. One afternoon, as Sophie was changing Mr. James's bandages, she overheard whispers in the hallway. A colleague murmured, "I can't believe Taylor is assigned to take care of a VIP patient. Who knows what she's capable of?" The words struck her like a knife, making Sophie feel exhausted, pressured, and doubtful of her abilities. However, at that moment, Mr. James spoke up. "Nurse Taylor," he asked gently, "are you okay?" Sophie gave a weak smile, though emotions she couldn't fully express were rising within her. "Just a busy day, sir. Nothing I can't handle." Mr. James's words were an invisible source of encouragement, helping Sophie stay strong. He continued, his gaze profound. "There's a big difference between handling things and growing from them. You're better than you think." Those words were a comfort, making Sophie feel less alone, even though coldness and discrimination surrounded her. The next morning, the hospital was in chaos. A high-risk emergency surgery was about to take place, causing tension among the staff. Amid the turmoil, Dr. Thomas Smith approached Sophie, his voice calm but cold. "Nurse Taylor, you'll assist in the surgery this afternoon. It's a serious case, but I believe you can handle it." Sophie was surprised but didn't let any doubt show in her voice. "Yes, Dr. Thomas Smith, I'll be ready." As he walked away, she heard him mumble, "Let's see how you handle the pressure." In the operating room, the tension was palpable. Every move was being closely watched. Sophie worked tirelessly, but as the surgery continued, she sensed something was wrong. Dr. Thomas Smith's hands were trembling as he prepared to make a critical decision. She felt the danger to the patient's life and quickly spoke up. "Dr. Thomas Smith, perhaps we should approach this from a different angle." The entire room fell silent, everyone surprised by Sophie's decisiveness. Thomas Smith glared at her, both angry and astonished. But eventually he agreed and changed his approach. The surgery was successful, and a bit of respect from her colleagues began to surface, though Thomas Smith's gaze still carried resentment. After the surgery, Dr. Thomas Smith requested a private meeting with Sophie. The door closed, and the air grew tense. He could no longer contain his anger. "What did you do? Challenge my authority?" he shouted. Sophie remained calm, responding firmly. "I only did what was necessary to ensure the patient's safety." But Thomas Smith's words became cruel, personal, and filled with discrimination. As their confrontation reached its peak, a voice came from the door. "Dr. Thomas Smith, I think you've forgotten who you're talking to." It was Mr. James. His stern face and sharp, authoritative gaze made Thomas Smith falter. "I've heard enough to know that the way you're treating Nurse Taylor is unacceptable," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. Sophie stood still, unable to believe what was happening. Mr. James, the man she was caring for, was not just a VIP patient. He was a person of power, and now he was standing up to defend her. His words were a powerful shock to Thomas Smith, who paled. "Who are you?" Dr. Thomas Smith asked, his voice no longer full of confidence. James smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm the one who can decide the future of this hospital. And right now I see no reason to continue supporting an organization that allows racism and unprofessional behavior to exist." Thomas Smith's expression changed, and he could do nothing but remain silent. This story, which began with discrimination against a nurse, had now become a confrontation between power and justice. The atmosphere in the room was frozen. Sophie felt a wave of mixed emotions. First, relief that someone had finally spoken out about the injustices she had endured for so long. But soon after, anger rose within her, because these wrongs had gone on for far too long and were far too obvious. These emotions swept over her like a powerful wave, but deep down she still held on to a glimmer of hope, a small belief that things could change. Sophie had no idea that this confrontation would ignite a series of events that would shake Bright Horizons Hospital, exposing deep-seated biases and forcing the organization to face a revolution. The pressure in the room continued to rise as Mr. James, with his unshaken expression, continued to deliver sharp criticisms towards Dr. Thomas Smith, who was now nearly losing his composure. Sweat soaked his brow. His eyes filled with confusion and anger, but he could do nothing but remain silent. At that moment, a nurse knocked on the door and poked her head in with a worried look. "Dr. Thomas Smith, the hospital management is urgently looking for you." Dr. Smith's face became tense, and he hesitated before quickly leaving the room. The room was left with only Sophie and Mr. James, a silence settling between them. Sophie felt the tension as if it could be sliced into pieces. Finally, Mr. James broke the silence. His voice softened. "I think it's time I officially introduce myself. I'm Oliver James, CEO of LifePath Healthcare." Sophie couldn't hide her shock. LifePath Healthcare, a giant corporation in the healthcare industry, renowned for its influence and financial power. The words Mr. James had spoken earlier about possibly changing or even dismantling the hospital now made complete sense. "Mr. James, Sophie stammered, unsure of what to say, her mind still unable to process what was happening. "Sit down, we have a lot to discuss," Mr. James said, pointing to the chair beside the bed. In the hours that followed, Mr. James shared his observations about the toxic environment at Bright Horizons, including the subtle discrimination Sophie had been enduring. He emphasized, "Your experiences, Nurse Taylor, unfortunately, are not isolated incidents, but this is unacceptable and must stop." For the first time during her time at the hospital, Sophie felt truly heard and respected. The conversation continued with groundbreaking decisions. Mr. James demanded a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory behaviors, the organization of mandatory training sessions on diversity and inclusion, and a complete overhaul of the hospital's hiring and promotion processes. His voice was firm as he called for an investigation into Dr. Thomas Smith's actions, showing his determination to implement these changes. The next day, Bright Horizons was shaken by the presence of reporters gathered outside, and hospital staff buzzed with rumors about the upcoming major changes. Sophie, now the center of attention, received apologies from some colleagues, while others approached her to ask about the reforms. As the workday ended, Sophie returned to Mr. James's office to thank him. He smiled and informed her that he had nominated her for the new Diversity and Inclusion Committee. "Your experience will be invaluable in restructuring Bright Horizons," he said. Sophie left the hospital with newfound hope, believing that these changes would not only benefit her but the entire healthcare system. Little did she know, the story of a dedicated nurse and a powerful patient would become the catalyst for a major revolution in the healthcare industry. As she exited the hospital, Sophie bumped into Amelia, one of the nurses who had previously been indifferent to her, walking toward her with an awkward smile. "I just wanted to apologize for how I treated you." "I didn't realize," Amelia said, her voice sincere. Sophie nodded, accepting the apology but unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, the hospital's PA system announced, "All staff must attend an emergency meeting in the main hall within 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory." The hall was packed when Sophie arrived. She chose a seat toward the back, fully aware of the curious stares and whispers around her. At the front, she saw Mr. James in a well-tailored suit, his arm still in a sling. He was talking with the hospital's management and several senior representatives. When everyone had settled, Mr. James stepped onto the stage. His presence immediately silenced the room. "Good morning," he began, his voice deep and authoritative. "For those who don't know, I'm Oliver James, CEO of LifePath Healthcare. Over the past week, I have been a patient here at Bright Horizons, recovering from a skiing accident. During this time, I have had the opportunity to observe the daily operations and culture at this hospital." He paused, looking around the room. What I witnessed was truly alarming. A culture of discrimination, favoritism, and unprofessional behavior. Things that have no place in modern healthcare. A wave of murmurs spread across the room. Some employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. Mr. James continued, "These incidents, particularly the way Nurse Sophie Taylor was treated, are not isolated cases. They are signs of a systemic issue that has gone on for far too long." All eyes in the room turned to Sophie. She sat up straight, calmly meeting their gazes. Mr. James began outlining the immediate changes that would take place: a thorough investigation into discriminatory behavior, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a complete overhaul of the hiring and promotion processes. He emphasized, "Anyone found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior will face serious consequences. This includes Dr. Thomas Smith, who has been suspended while awaiting the full investigation results." The room once again erupted into chaos. Sophie noticed some of Dr. Thomas Smith's colleagues appeared shocked and angry, while others seemed relieved. "I know these changes will be difficult, Mr. James continued. "But this is not just the right thing to do morally. It's necessary to provide the best possible care for our patients." As his speech concluded, Mr. James made a final announcement that left the room stunned. "I'd like to introduce the person who will lead these changes, Nurse Sophie Taylor. She has agreed to take on the role of Diversity Director at Bright Horizons." Sophie was stunned, feeling the mixed emotions of her colleagues, from surprise and respect to outright anger. As she walked up to the podium, she took a deep breath and said, "I stand here not as an adversary but as a colleague. I believe in the potential of Bright Horizons and everyone in this room. Together we will create an environment where all employees are respected and every patient receives the best care possible." Her words caused many to nod in agreement, while others fell into deep thought. After the meeting, Sophie received congratulations and apologies from colleagues, a sign that the cultural shift at Bright Horizons had begun. In the following weeks, she and Mr. James worked on implementing reforms, facing many challenges, but also bringing new hope to the hospital. A year later, at a national healthcare conference, Sophie shared the story of the reform journey at Bright Horizons, emphasizing that change is possible with determination. She proved that from a nurse enduring discrimination, she could become the one who made a difference, not only for the hospital, but for the entire healthcare industry. The road ahead was still long, but Sophie was ready to face any challenge to build a more inclusive and fair healthcare system. Thank you for following Sophie Taylor's emotional and determined journey at Bright Horizons Hospital. Her story is not just a lesson in resilience and self-belief, but a reminder that each of us can make a change, big or small. What do you think about the reforms Sophie implemented? Comment too if you think Sophie did the right thing. Please share your thoughts and feelings about the story. Don't forget to like if you found this story inspiring and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting videos. Together, we'll create a strong community where meaningful stories are always shared and spread. See you in the next video.